February 14, 1943. The chill of the Tunisian dawn still clung to the rocky plain near Sidi Bouzid as a pale sun pushed through dust blown from the east, coating the olive groves and the low ridgelines with a thin veil of ochre. He stood beside a stalled American half-track, its engine ticking as it cooled, and watched the distant silhouettes of tanks appear like dark moving stones on the horizon. The sound reached him first, deep, rhythmic thuds carried by the cold air, not the uncertain clatter of inexperienced engines, but the confident, mechanical heartbeat of an army that had been fighting since Poland, France, Greece, and beyond. It was the Afrika Korps, and it was closing fast. Around him, the young American infantrymen moved with a confusion that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with inexperience. Boots slid on the dusty rocks as officers shouted conflicting orders. Radios crackled with half-finished phrases, and men craned their necks toward the ridges where German panzers maneuvered with unnerving precision. The narrator felt the shift in atmosphere, the stillness of moments before disaster, when the air seems heavier with the understanding that something irreversible is about to happen. The first shells landed near the forward American outposts, sharp blasts that kicked up twin geysers of earth and smoke. Men ducked instinctively, some dropping rifles, others scrambling for cover behind vehicles that offered little protection. The ground trembled as the German armored columns began to press forward, their tracks grinding through the hard soil with the steady calculation of hunters herding confused prey. From his vantage point, he could see American tank destroyers attempting to form a line, their commanders waving frantically for crews to reposition, but the coordination wasn't there. The U.S. Army in Tunisia was still learning the craft of mechanized warfare, and today that lack of experience showed like a raw wound. A platoon of M3 Lee tanks lurched forward, their high silhouettes instantly drawing German fire. Flames erupted from the first hit vehicle, its turret popping open like a scorched tin can. The narrator watched men spill out, some crawling, some running, all swallowed immediately by chaos. Orders to withdraw came too late. The German armor had already bypassed the American flanks, rolling forward with a confidence born of years of battlefield adaptation. He could hear the panic growing in the radio chatter, broken transmissions, misidentified enemy positions, and commanders calling for reserves that were already trapped or destroyed. Sidi Bouzid collapsed in hours. The American defenses, spread too thin and commanded by officers who underestimated German mobility, buckled under the coordinated assault. As he retreated with the surviving units toward the west, dust choking his lungs and the metallic tang of burning equipment lingering in the air, he felt the weight of realization settle on him. This wasn't a skirmish, and it wasn't an isolated setback. This was the opening act of something larger and far more dangerous. The Afrika Korps was advancing unhindered, and the road ahead was long and exposed. And as the sun set, painting the ridges red, he understood the truth that no one dared say aloud, that the real battle had not even begun.
The morning of February 16th, 1943, rose slowly over the battered outskirts of Sbeitla, revealing a landscape reshaped by fire and steel. Edward Hale stood beside a line of smoldering wrecks, trucks overturned, guns abandoned, crates of ammunition spilled onto the ground like discarded promises. The cold air tasted of burned oil and drifting sand, every breath carrying the sharpness of defeat. Somewhere behind the nearest ridge, the low growl of German engines throbbed like a steady drumbeat, growing closer with every hour. Around him, American units streamed westward in a retreat that had long since lost any semblance of control. Young infantrymen stumbled through the dust with rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. Medics hurried past carrying improvised stretchers. Drivers pushed their vehicles to the limit, engines knocking loudly as they swerved around the debris scattered across the narrow tracks that served as roads. The smoke hung heavy above Sbeitla, its thick coils spiraling into the cloudless sky. Hale watched a group of officers huddled over a map on the back of a half-track, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion and disbelief. The radio on the hood crackled with broken messages. Enemy armor breaching the north flank, another battalion cut off east of town, artillery positions abandoned. The officers tried to issue orders, but their voices were drowned out by the rumble of retreating columns. The U.S. Army was trying to reorganize while its structure dissolved in real time. German tanks appeared suddenly on the distant high ground, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. They moved with the ease of men who had done this 100 times before, probing, flanking, tightening the noose. Hale recognized the precision of their formation, each armored spearhead advancing in perfect coordination, each artillery burst placed exactly where the Americans were attempting to regroup. It was not simply firepower overwhelming them. It was the deadly fluency of veterans who instinctively sensed the weaknesses of a young army still grappling with the basics of modern warfare. As Hale walked with a retreating infantry column, he passed the charred remains of an American armored battalion. 2 M10 tank destroyers lay half sunken in the sand, their guns pointed uselessly at the sky. A truck carrying ammunition had detonated hours earlier, leaving a still warm crater at the center of the clearing. Men skirted around it without comment. The shock of destruction had faded. Now there was only grim acceptance. Yet, amid this collapse, Hale saw moments of resistance. Small pockets of soldiers forming hasty firing lines behind broken walls or the twisted frames of vehicles. They fired disciplined bursts, delaying the Germans for minutes at a time before necessity forced them to withdraw again. It wasn't a lack of bravery, it was a lack of cohesion. The Americans had the will to fight, but they lacked the hardened instincts and seamless coordination that German units carried into every engagement. By midday, Sbeitla had fallen. Hale stood at the edge of the shattered town square, watching columns of black smoke rising like warning beacons. Behind him, retreating forces scrambled onto trucks, clung to tank hulls, or simply ran. Men trying to escape the tightening grip of an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. Nothing about this retreat was orderly. It was a race against annihilation. As Hale climbed into a truck heading toward the narrowing roads leading into the Kasserine Pass, he felt an unwelcome clarity settle into his thoughts. These defeats were not isolated stumbles. They were symptoms of something deeper, a structural flaw in the American command, doctrine, and experience. And unless someone found a way to stop the momentum building behind the Afrika Korps, the pass ahead would not be a defensive position. It would be the place where the campaign broke completely.
By the evening of February 18, 1943, Edward Hale stood on a rocky rise overlooking the eastern mouth of the Kasserine Pass, the wind carrying with it the bitter scent of cordite and the distant echo of engines grinding through the valleys behind him. The landscape ahead was a maze of jagged ridges and narrow gaps, carved over millennia into a natural fortress that now served as the final barrier between the advancing Afrika Korps and the vulnerable Allied rear areas stretching toward Tebessa. The pass, framed by steep cliffs the color of rusted iron, looked ancient and indifferent, unmoved by the armies preparing to bleed within it. Below Hale, American engineers worked feverishly through the gathering dusk, their silhouettes bending and straightening as they laid mines, dug shallow emplacements, and dragged artillery pieces into firing positions. Trucks growled as they backed into hastily cleared turnouts, unloading crates of ammunition that thudded onto the ground with a dull finality.
Officers shouted to one another, voices raised not in panic this time, but in something closer to determination. The defeat at Sidi Bouzid and the flight through Sbeitla had shaken them deeply, but now the army was trying to gather the fragments of its shattered confidence and forge a defense worthy of the terrain. To the east, flashes of light flickered on the horizon. German guns testing range, marking their presence with the casual confidence of a predator circling before the strike. Hale felt the tremor of each distant explosion through the soles of his boots. He had watched the Afrika Korps carve its way across the ridgelines over the past days, always moving faster than expected, always arriving where American commanders least wanted them. But here, in this narrow wound in the mountains, something shifted. The terrain constricted movement. The open flanking maneuvers that had devastated U.S. units earlier were no longer possible. The pass forced both armies into a corridor of rock and dust where decisions mattered as much as momentum. Far behind German lines, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studied the same terrain from the opposite side. Hale did not see Rommel himself, but he felt the weight of the man's decisions pressing toward the pass like a gathering storm. Reports drifting through the American ranks described the commander moving with restless energy from one forward point to another, examining the fold of every hill, the angle of every approach, gauging how best to break the Allied line in two. Rommel understood the stakes perfectly. If he pierced Kasserine, he could split the American Second Corps from the British forces to the north, isolate supply lines, and perhaps force a retreat so deep it would undo months of Allied progress in North Africa. Hale saw the danger clearly as he watched the pass swallowed by darkness. The terrain favored the defender, but only if the defender possessed discipline, communication, and unity. Qualities the American forces had not yet demonstrated in this campaign. The troops arriving from scattered units were tired, disoriented, and still shaken from earlier defeats. Artillery batteries were out of position, armor units unsure where to anchor themselves, infantry companies arriving with incomplete equipment lists and half their officers absent. Yet the pass had to hold. If it fell quickly, the road to Tebessa and to the entire Allied rear lay open. He moved toward a ridge overlooking the western defile and listened to the murmured conversations of officers trying to calculate how long their improvised lines might last. Some believed the Germans would strike at dawn. Others feared they would attack in the dead of night, exploiting the moonless sky to push through before the Americans could coordinate. Hale knew that whatever choice Rommel made, it would be the one least expected, the one most likely to unravel the fragile defense already stretched thin across the rocks. As the final traces of daylight faded and the mountains turned into jagged silhouettes against a starless sky, Hale felt the air shift. It was the feeling he had learned to recognize in the past week, the feeling that the moment just before disaster had arrived. The pass was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that trembled with anticipation. Soon the Germans would test this last barrier, and if the Americans failed to meet them with something stronger than what they had shown before, the pass would not slow the enemy. It would simply guide them deeper into Allied territory. Night settled heavily over the Kasserine Pass, the wind sweeping down the rocky slopes with a low whistle that carried dust into every crevice. Edward Hale stood on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley floor, his breath visible in the cold darkness as he watched new arrivals move quietly into position. Engines idled under heavy tarps. Artillery crews whispered as they adjusted elevation wheels with chilled fingers, and tank silhouettes crouched like metallic beasts waiting for an unseen signal. Among the controlled chaos, one figure moved with particular purpose, a compact, resolute man whose calm authority seemed to pull scattered fragments of the defense into coherent shape. Brigadier General Paul Morris Robinette. Hale had heard the name before in passing, but seeing him here, walking the line with a small notebook in hand and a flashlight covered with a red lens, the weight of his presence became unmistakably clear. Where other officers barked orders, Robinette listened first, nodding as tank commanders explained their fields of fire, asking short questions about ammunition reserves, signaling artillery officers to reposition guns by mere inches to avoid dead angles. He carried himself not with theatrical bravado, but with the practiced steadiness of a man who understood that the thin line drawn here could decide the fate of an entire campaign. Hale followed him at a respectful distance, observing how Robinette's sharp eyes moved constantly from terrain to map to faces. He studied the ridges as if memorizing every fold of the earth, evaluating how each outcrop might shape the coming battle. He directed engineers to prepare fallback positions with interlocking sectors of machine gun fire, ordered tank destroyers to relocate behind natural depressions that would reveal only their guns, and arranged artillery in depth with overlapping arcs that stretched like invisible nets across the valley. What struck Hale most was the quiet patience with which Robinette worked. He spoke in a low, deliberate voice, as if each word carried its own weight. Officers leaned in when he gave instructions. Crews straightened unconsciously when he passed. Even the most shaken soldiers seemed to steady themselves at the sound of his calm tone. There was no urgency in his steps, but there was not a moment wasted. He was building something, an integrated defense with layers of surprise, traps, and choke points, something very different from the scattered reactions of previous days. Robinette paused atop a small rise, studying the narrow corridor that the Germans would inevitably choose. Hale could almost feel the general's thoughts as he traced the invisible path the panzers would take. First probing fire, then armored thrust, then the tightening push to break through. Robinette adjusted his tanks accordingly, ranging them in concealed positions where their first volleys could strike from flanking angles. He coordinated his artillery to fire in pre-planned sequences, overlapping salvos designed to disrupt momentum rather than merely destroy. "He knows what's coming," Hale murmured to himself as he watched Robinette's silhouette outlined against the faint glow of distant fires. "And he's preparing for it like a man who refuses to give the enemy a single easy yard." At one point, Robinette stopped beside a young lieutenant, trembling slightly as he checked his men's foxholes. Instead of chastisement, the general offered a few steadying words, placing a hand briefly on the officer's shoulder. Whatever he said, it worked. The young man straightened, gathered his platoon, and moved with renewed clarity. The night deepened, the wind shifted, carrying faint metallic echoes from the eastern approach, distant engines, the scrape of tracks against stone. The Germans were on the move again. Hale saw Robinette pause for a moment, gazing into the darkness, and in that quiet stillness, the general's role became unmistakable. He was the anchor in this fragile defensive web, the mind countering Rommel's advance not with brute force, but with disciplined preparation. As Hale turned to move back to his observation point, he realized that this man, standing almost alone at the midpoint of the pass, represented the first true obstacle the Afrika Korps had faced in days. The American line had been bloodied, shaken, scattered, but here, under Robinette, it finally felt cohesive. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Rommel's columns were nearing the mouth of the pass, unaware that the battle ahead would not unfold as easily as the ones before.
February 21, 1943 arrived with a pale, brittle dawn, its light stretching thin across the jagged walls of the Kasserine Pass. Edward Hale stood at his observation post on a rocky shelf overlooking the valley floor, his hands stiff from the night's cold. Below him, the American line lay silent but alert, artillery crews ready at their guns, tank destroyers camouflaged beneath nets and brush,
Infantry dug into the stone-hard earth. The quiet had a density to it, a fragile tension that felt ready to snap with the first enemy shell. And then, as if on cue, the eastern horizon flickered. German artillery opened fire. The first rounds exploded across the forward slopes, sending geysers of earth and rock into the air. Dust rose in thick orange plumes. Hale braced himself as the barrage intensified, turning the valley into a trembling furnace of concussive blasts. Yet behind him, the American guns held their silence, waiting, because Robinette had ordered it so. Nothing would be wasted, no premature fire, no nervous reaction. They would strike when the Germans committed. Moments later, the rumble of engines reached the pass. The German armored spearhead emerged through the settling haze like dark shapes materializing from another world. Panzers moved in tight formations, their hulls angled to deflect fire, their commanders confident after days of sweeping success. Behind them marched Italian infantry, shoulders hunched beneath their gear, trying to keep pace with the armored columns. The leading tanks advanced cautiously, scanning the cliffs for signs of ambush. But Robinette's positions remained hidden, silent, invisible. Hale felt his breath catch as the German vanguard moved deeper into the kill zone, every second pulling them closer to the point where the general's carefully constructed defense would spring shut. Then, as if on cue, Robinette gave the signal. The American line erupted. Tank destroyers opened fire from flanking high ground, their shots slamming into the sides of the first German tanks with brutal precision. Artillery from the rear positions thundered in coordinated volleys, shells cascading onto the advancing columns and scattering infantry in chaotic bursts. Machine gun nests cut down exposed units trying to regroup. For the first time in days, the Afrika Korps faltered. Hale watched the German commanders struggle to understand what had gone wrong. Their assumption of an easy breakthrough evaporated the moment their tanks began to burn. Smoke curled upward in heavy black pillars. The Italian infantry broke first, panicking under the sudden, overlapping fire, some fleeing back toward the ridgelines while German officers shouted in vain to stop them. The second German wave attempted to push through the bottleneck, but the pass offered no room for maneuver. Vehicles collided, stalled, or became trapped behind wrecks already blocking the narrow track. Robinette's artillery shifted its fire methodically, pounding the immobilized units with relentless accuracy. Hours passed in a blur of thunder and smoke. Hale watched the American crews working with a discipline he had not witnessed anywhere else in the campaign. Men reloading guns with mechanical precision, tank destroyers repositioning between shots, infantry adjusting fields of fire without waiting for orders. Robinette had reshaped them, brought coherence where chaos had ruled. By evening, the pass held. But Rommel was not finished. February 22nd dawned harsh and windless. Hale barely slept before the next assault began. This time, the Germans attacked with renewed ferocity, barrage after barrage crashing into the American positions, followed by armored thrusts that tried to force a breakthrough before the defenders could reset. Once again, the American line bent but did not break. German tanks pushed farther into the valley than the day before, only to meet close-range fire from concealed positions Robinette had prepared in the night. The shells struck with devastating effect, ripping through armor and leaving burning hulks in their wake. Confusion spread among the attackers. Rommel himself recognized the shift. These were the same Americans he had routed days earlier, but something had changed. They were organized. They were disciplined. They were fighting with a resolve that matched the terrain they defended. By late afternoon, the German advance slowed to a crawl. Casualties mounted, ammunition dwindled, and the narrow pass became a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. Hale watched the final push collapse under concentrated artillery fire, leaving the valley littered with the wrecks of an army that believed victory inevitable. The pass had held. The Afrika Korps had been stopped, not by chance, but by deliberate resistance, by Robinette's design,
and by an American force that refused to repeat its earlier failures. As Hale looked out over the smoking ruins of the battlefield, he realized that these 2 days had changed the trajectory of the entire campaign. Something in the American army had awakened, and Rommel, under the veil of darkness, had sensed it too.
When the smoke finally settled over the Kasserine Pass, Edward Hale descended from his observation ridge and walked among the wreckage left behind. The valleys still trembled with the fading echoes of artillery, and the acrid smell of burned metal clung to the cold morning air. Twisted tank hulls lay scattered across the narrow corridor like the bones of ancient beasts, their scorched armor reflecting the dull glow of a rising sun. American medics moved quietly among the debris, tending to the wounded, whispering to each other in subdued voices that carried a strange mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They had held. Against all expectation, they had held. Yet Hale sensed it immediately. This victory was not triumph. It was revelation. German forces, which had pushed so confidently through Sidi Bouzid and Sbeitla, had now withdrawn eastward under Rommel's personal order. Hale had heard the reports. Rommel, standing on a rocky ledge the previous night, studying the field with a tense expression that betrayed his frustration. He was a commander who understood the rhythm of campaigns, and he recognized the moment momentum reversed. Kasserine Pass had not broken the Americans. It had awakened them. As Hale walked deeper into the valley, he overheard officers discussing the aftermath. Communications had been uneven, coordination still flawed, and units had nearly broken under pressure. But something essential had changed. The U.S. Army had learned. They had been bloodied, humiliated, and nearly crushed, but in those same hours they had found the first outlines of discipline, cohesion, and adaptability, the traits that seasoned armies carried into battle as instinct rather than instruction. In the following days, the consequences unfolded quickly. American High Command moved decisively. Lieutenant General Lloyd Frendendahl, whose confusing orders and distant command style had contributed to the earlier collapses, was relieved. In his place arrived Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a figure whose energy and uncompromising standards swept across two corps like a sudden wind. Hale watched Patton's arrival from a distance, noting the crisp movements, the steel in the man's posture, the sharpness in his eyes. Patton inspected positions with relentless scrutiny, demanding discipline in every gesture, every formation, every piece of equipment. There was no tolerance for disarray, no room for complacency. Under his command, the American Army began to transform with startling speed. Training intensified, supply lines were restructured, communication protocols were rewritten. Armored tactics shifted from rigid textbook patterns to aggressive, dynamic operations modeled after the very enemy they had just faced. Hale observed the changes like a man watching raw ore being hammered into steel. The lessons of Kasserine were not recorded on chalkboards. They were carved directly into the minds of every soldier who had survived the pass. Meanwhile, Rommel's assessment of the Americans changed. Reports spread quietly among captured German officers. The Americans were no longer the inexperienced force that had crumbled under initial pressure. They were learning faster than expected, far faster than the Afrika Korps could afford. Rommel, worn down by illness and dwindling supplies, knew his window of opportunity had closed. In March, the tide turned fully. The Americans advanced through central Tunisia with newfound confidence, linking with British forces to encircle the German-Italian army. The battles of El Guettar, Meknassi, and eventually the final push to Tunis demonstrated an unmistakable truth. The army that had fled through Sbeitla was not the same army that now crossed the plains with disciplined aggression. Hale saw this transformation firsthand. He watched infantry units maneuver with coordination that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He saw tank crews who once panicked under fire, now advancing with purposeful resolve. Artillery batteries operated with near-mechanical precision, their shells landing in tight, devastating patterns. The Americans had learned through failure, painful, humiliating failure, and emerged stronger. As the Tunisian campaign drew to a close and Allied victory approached, Hale stood once more on a quiet ridge at dusk. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape that had shaped the turning point of an army. The past lay silent now, its rocks bearing no outward trace of the fear, desperation, and determination that had played out within its narrow throat. He breathed deeply, sensing that the significance of Kasserine extended far beyond these mountains. It was not simply a battle lost and regained. It was the moment the U.S. Army shed the last illusions of war as theory and confronted war as reality, and adapted. From Tunisia to Sicily, from the beaches of Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy, the lessons born here would echo through every American assault that followed. Kasserine had exposed their weaknesses brutally, but in doing so had revealed the path to future victories. As Hale descended the ridge in the fading light, he understood that the true legacy of Kasserine was not defeat. It was transformation, a transformation that would reshape the course of the entire war.